On May 10th, 2025, 2 days after becoming Pope, Leo XIV addressed the College of Cardinals for the first time. During this address, he gave the reason for his choice of the name Leo, saying that he chose the name because, quote, Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social questions in the context of the First Great Industrial Revolution, end quote. The next week, when addressing the diplomatic corps of the Holy See, Leo said the same thing, stating, quote, I chose my name thinking, first of all, of Leo XIII, the Pope of the First Great Social Encyclical, Rerum Novarum, end quote. Yet this groundbreaking encyclical by Pope Leo XIII is not simply a favorite of Leo XIV, but has been a favorite of the papacy going back to its writing in 1891. In fact, it has been the explicit subject of 4 encyclical letters in dozens of papal audiences, sermons, and letters. In fact, it is probably the most commented on papal encyclical of all time. St. Pius X called it that celebrated encyclical. Benedict XV told anti-socialists to, quote, always have before their eyes and scrupulously observe what was taught in Rerum Novarum. Pius XI stated that the teaching of the encyclical made it illustrious forever. Venerable Pius XII stated that, quote, Rerum Novarum set forth a living and clear stream of strong social sense. St. John the 23rd called it that magnificent encyclical. St. Paul VI was so enamored with Rerum Novarum that he consistently gave different homilies and other allocutions on the anniversaries of the publication of Rerum Novarum. St. John Paul II called it, quote, the encyclical that marked the beginning of the modern social teaching of the Church. Francis stated that Rerum Novarum, quote, in a prophetic way initiated the great reflection on the social doctrine of the Church. This is for good reason. Rerum Novarum has provided us with those principles of Catholic social teaching that are able to universally apply across the board to a variety of different circumstances. Therefore, all the popes have needed to do to treat the issues in their time was to apply Rerum Novarum. This is what makes the study of Rerum Novarum so fruitful for our understanding of Catholicism. It is able to build true competence for political thought. By prudently considering the circumstances we find ourselves in, we are able to apply the principles of Catholic social teaching in the place and time we find ourselves in. In light of this, we are able to strike the careful balance between indifference and ideology that has been spoken of recently by Pope Leo XIV. As stated in an address given on Saturday, May 17, 2025, quote, Doctrine, as a serious, serene, and rigorous discourse, aims to teach us primarily how to approach problems, and, even more importantly, how to approach people. It also helps us to make prudential judgments when confronted with challenges. Seriousness, rigor, and serenity are what we must learn from every doctrine, including the Church's social doctrine, end quote. It is here that we can bring forward another set of fundamental considerations in any study of Catholic social teaching. If, as we have seen, questions of Catholic social teaching requires the application of principles to concrete circumstances, then it takes on a unique character compared to other areas of church teaching. If we were considering the teaching on the Trinity or Christology, obviously there would be a certain degree of concreteness and immutability in the pronouncements of the teaching church. Yet the situation in Catholic social teaching is slightly different. Popes and bishops are able to issue binding doctrinal pronouncements on matters of principle in Catholic social teaching, since these are moral matters. On the other hand, matters of circumstance are often detached from these principles, or may require the application of different principles. So the Church's teaching on these matters are more in line with seriously taken recommendations, rather than binding doctrinal pronouncements. As St. John Paul II said about his own encyclical on this matter, quote, the present encyclical seeks to show the fruitfulness of the principles enunciated by Leo XIII, which belong to the Church's doctrinal patrimony, and, as such, involve the exercise of her teaching authority. But pastoral solicitude also prompts me to propose an analysis of some events of recent history. It goes without saying that part of the responsibility of pastors is to give careful consideration to current events in order to discern the new requirements of evangelization. However, such an analysis is not meant to pass definitive judgments, since this does not fall per se within the magisterium's specific domain, end quote. To give a recent example, we can think of the immigration disputes in the United States. In February 2025, Pope Francis sent a letter to the American Episcopate going over certain matters of Catholic social teaching on immigration. As Catholics, we are bound to give religious submission of will and intellect to each of the doctrinal pronouncements of this letter, where it speaks about Catholic social teaching on things like refugees, migration, etc. Yet there are many, many matters in this letter that require the application of principles to concrete circumstances. For example, Pope Francis wrote, quote, "The act of deporting people, who in many cases have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment, damages the dignity of many men and women, and of entire families, and places them in a state of particular vulnerability and defenselessness." End quote. This is, of course, true. It would take a unique form of disregard for human dignity to disagree with this. Yet it is a completely different question whether this is an accurate portrayal of the political program of President Trump in relation to mass deportations. It is entirely possible that His Holiness was mistaken in his consideration of the American situation. Yet, if I were to acknowledge that, after a serious consideration of the words of His Holiness, it would in no way require that I am disregarding his sacred authority. Rather, I would be promoting the submission to his authority by distinguishing properly when he intends to exercise this authority. It is for this reason that Catholic social teaching is uniquely a place for reflection from laymen rather than simply from clerics. The Church gives us those principles of Catholic social teaching and certain recommendations for how this can be carried out generally, but it is for laymen to apply these principles in their day-to-day lives. This was beautifully set forward by St. Paul VI when he wrote, quote, "Lay people must consider it their task to improve the temporal order. While the hierarchy has the role of teaching and authoritatively interpreting the moral laws and precepts that apply in this matter, the laity have the duty of using their own initiative and taking action in this area without waiting passively for directives and precepts from others. They must try to infuse a Christian spirit into people's mental outlook and daily behavior, into the laws and structures of the civil community." End quote. It is for this reason that the Second Vatican Council renewed the call of the Church for the specifically lay apostolate in its decree on the apostolate of the laity. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Second Vatican Council. Many people are under the false impression that greater involvement of the laity involves churchy things that are tied up with the liturgy. Thus, if a woman wants to be involved in Catholic action, she thinks that this might involve becoming a lector or extraordinary minister of Holy Communion at Mass. But this is a false and egregious clericalization to pretend that it is only helping out the liturgy that counts as Catholic action. In accordance with the teaching of the Church, the most proper domain of lay Catholic action is the temporal sphere. Quote, "Correctly fulfilling their secular duties in the ordinary conditions of life," end quote, and quote, "developing earnestly the qualities and talents bestowed on them in accord with these conditions of life," end quote. Further, the Second Vatican Council teaches that, even above works of charity, quote, "preeminent among the works of this type of apostolate is that of Christian social action, which the Sacred Synod desires to see extended to the whole temporal sphere, including culture," end quote. So, if we wanted to truly follow the mind of the Second Vatican Council and the lay apostolate, it wouldn't look like Susan from the parish council becoming a lector at Mass and adding 10 new extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. Rather, it would look like frequenting the sacraments in order to better carry out one's familial and professional duties, encouraging families to have more children and to raise them properly, working towards conforming civil law to the mind of the Church, engaging in works of mercy, defending the teachings of the Church from those who oppose it, etc. The teaching of the Church on the lay apostolate is one of the greatest cures for clericalization by elevating the temporal sphere to its true spiritual significance. One of the greatest bastardizations of the Second Vatican Council is that many have turned this teaching into a way to democratize the sacred actions of the clergy. The action relevant to our study is described in paragraph 14 of the decree, where it states, quote, "In loyalty to their country and in faithful fulfillment of their civic obligations, Catholics should feel themselves obliged to promote the true common good. Thus they should make the weight of their opinion felt, in order that the civil authority may act with justice, and that legislation may conform to moral precepts and the common good. Catholics skilled in public affairs and adequately enlightened in faith and Christian doctrine should not refuse to administer public affairs, since by doing this in a worthy manner, they can both further the common good and at the same time prepare the way for the gospel." End quote. It is important to emphasize that this work of the laity in the temporal order is not merely a right, it is a duty that is imposed upon us by law. One of the obligations imposed on the laity in Canon 222 of the Code of Canon Law is, quote, "to promote social justice." which is essentially contained in the promotion of the teachings contained in Rerum Novarum. In fact, as pointed out by authors on Catholic Action, it is often to the grave detriment of the honor due to the priesthood and Catholic Action itself when clerics involve themselves too much in those matters touching concrete circumstances. A French author who wrote on Catholic Action, Jean Nousset, highlights many of these difficulties in Part 2, Chapter 3 of his work, Action. So if you are out there as a layman wondering why you should even study these issues of Catholic Action in the first place, know that it is because it is in your hands. The Church has demanded it, and Pope after Pope has emphasized it. You are not required to wait for the hierarchy to give specific directions. It is in your hands to use prudence and apply these principles to the time and place where you exist. This is the great honor that the Church has called laymen to. In summary, we need to oppose two contrary ideologies that often arise in the Church. First, the clericalization of the temporal sphere. This tendency falsely pretends that it must be the clerics who ordinarily take the initiative and lead Catholic Action efforts rather than laymen. Rather, the Church teaches that the main role of the clergy in relation to such efforts is to teach principles, provide guidance, and, when necessary, judge the conformity or lack of conformity of the action with the principles of Catholic social teaching. Second, on the opposite extreme, there is the laicization of the spiritual. This tendency views the only important forms of Catholic action as those connected with the hierarchy, parish life, or the liturgy. Thus many, especially in older generations, ardently believe, for example, that unless women get involved in decision-making in the Church, the liturgy, or in its most extreme forms, become clerics, that they are not able to do worthwhile Catholic action. The Church opposes this by pointing to the true spiritual significance of the work done in the temporal sphere. To put it quite bluntly, the Church's teaching on the lay apostolate should cause women to think, I should have another baby, not I should sign up to be a lector. Now that we have went over all these principles of Catholic action, we can get to the document itself and the various different applications of the document throughout the last 135 years. Following the distinction we made above, we can distinguish between two aspects of these social teaching documents, which will help us focus our study on this matter. First, some parts of these documents consist in the laying out of the principles of Catholic social teaching. These enter directly under the doctrinal province of the Pope and directly bind our consciences. As Venerable Pius XII taught in Humani Generis, quote, "Nor must it be thought that what is expounded in encyclical letters does not of itself demand consent, since in writing such letters the popes do not exercise the supreme power of their teaching authority. For these matters are taught with the ordinary teaching authority, of which it is true to say, he who heareth you heareth me. And generally what is expounded and inculcated in encyclical letters already for other reasons appertain to Catholic doctrine." End quote. Second, other parts of these documents consist in giving certain practical directives in line with these principles of Catholic social teaching. While one is bound to give serious consideration to these directives, it would not be sinful, upon considering the issue, to come up with some different position on the matter of praxis rather than on a matter of principle. To give an example, let's say we did a study of Pope Francis' two documents on the environment, Laudato Si and Laudato Deum. In both of these documents, we can boil it down to a simple practical syllogism. The environment, according to Catholic social teaching, must be protected from those behaviors that endanger it. Now, such and such a practice endanger the environment as evidenced from these studies. Therefore, these practices must be stopped. Someone could go about disagreeing with the conclusion in two ways. First, you may have someone who disagrees with the first premise and does not think that it is Catholic teaching to guard the environment. This person would truly be dissenting from the teaching of the Church, which cannot be done without sin. Second, you may have someone who disagrees with the second premise. Let's say they don't think that dumping nuclear waste into a river harms the environment. This person would be an idiot, but not a heretic. In this video, we are going to focus on many of the issues that are of the first premise rather than of the second premise. While it is helpful to study these various different ways that the popes have applied Catholic social teaching to diverse circumstances throughout time, it is more helpful to study the principles themselves, which transcend time and space. We can summarize the theoretical teaching of Rerum Novarum in four fundamental principles. Ultimately, these principles are a systematic presentation of the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas. This was the intention of the two most influential ghostwriters of the encyclical, Cardinal Tommaso Maria Zigliara, a Dominican and strict observance Thomist who treats these same issues in his Summa Philosophica, and Father Matteo Liberatore, a Jesuit Thomist who treats this in his work Principles of Political Economy, which has been translated into English. The Catholic teaching provides a synthesis that is able to stand above and beyond both capitalism and socialism. As stated by Pius XI, quote, Leo XIII sought no help from either liberalism, that is, capitalism, or socialism, for the one had proved that it was utterly unable to solve the social problem aright, and the other, proposing a remedy far worse than the evil itself, would have plunged human society into great dangers. End quote. The four principles are as follows. First principle. The Church is both authoritative and necessary for the solution of social issues. Second principle. The ultimate end of the economy and of material goods is found in the religious and social good of the people, not in the merely material growth of the economy. Third principle. Due to the presence of man in domestic society, labor ought to result in a broad distribution of property and the means of production, which leads to the principles of the just wage and economic subsidiarity. Fourth principle. Due to the presence of man in civil society, the natural right of ownership of property is not absolute, and the use of property ought to be positively regulated by the state in line with the exigencies of the common good. The first foundational principle in Catholic social teaching concerns the Church's authority to teach on political and economic matters. This is simply put by St. Paul VI in his homily on this matter. Quote, why did the Pope speak? Did he have the right? Did he have the competence? Yes, we respond, because he had the duty. End quote. This teaching corrects two common errors. First, some people have the mistaken notion that the Church has only the ability to teach on, quote, religious matters. While it is true that there are two powers, the Church and the state, which are distinguished from one another, it is completely false that the Church has no capability to judge in matters that the state engages in. Political and economic matters are matters of morals, and the Church has authority over judging such moral matters. Thus, Leo XIII writes, quote, no practical solution of this question will be found apart from the intervention of religion and of the Church. It is we who are the chief guardian of religion, and the chief dispenser of what pertains to the Church. And by keeping silence, we would seem to neglect the duty incumbent on us. It is the Church that insists on the authority of the gospel, upon those teachings whereby the conflict can be brought to an end. End quote. This connection with the moral law is spoken of at length by Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, from paragraphs 41 to 43. He begins by stating that, quote, there resides in us the right and duty to pronounce with supreme authority upon social and economic matters, end quote. He distinguishes in economics between, quote, matters of technique and, quote, things connected with the moral law. He denies that the Church is suitably equipped to deal with the former, but he affirms that it is necessary that the Church speak on the latter. Another reason for this is the universality of the gospel message. The gospel message, contrary to the popular presentations given by many evangelicals, heals and saves not only the individual, but all the social relations that a man finds himself a part of. Christ is not only king of the human heart, but of families and of nations. Thus, the Compendium of Social Doctrine teaches, quote, men and women must respond to the gift of salvation with the whole of their lives, in every relationship that defines life, so as not to neglect anything, leaving it in a profane and worldly realm, where it is irrelevant or foreign to salvation. For this reason, the Church's social doctrine is not a privilege for her, nor a digression, a convenience or interference. It is her right to proclaim the gospel in the context of society, to make the liberating word of the gospel resound in the complex worlds of production, labor, business, finance, trade, politics, law, culture, social communications, where men and women live. End quote. This is why Pius XI, when treating the social kingship of Christ, stated, quote, the empire of our Redeemer embraces all men, nor is there any difference in this matter between the individual and the family or the state. For all men, whether collectively or individually, are under the domain of Christ. In him is the salvation of the individual. In him is the salvation of society. When once men recognize, both in private and in public life, that Christ is king, society will at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, well-ordered discipline, peace, and harmony. End quote. This is all beautifully summarized by Venerable Pius XII, who properly distinguishes between the theoretical and practical aspects of papal teaching on economics, writing, quote, it was in the profound conviction that the Church has not only the right, but even the duty to make an authoritative pronouncement on the social question, that Leo XIII addressed his message to the world. He had no intention of laying down guiding principles of the purely practical, we might say the technical side of the social structure, for he was well aware of the fact that the church does not claim such a mission. End quote. Beside those who believe that the church cannot judge on such matters, there is a more pernicious and subtle error that has pervaded many who have engaged in Catholic action. These individuals admit the authority of the church to teach in these matters, but deny its necessity. Thus they will say that the church's teaching binds the faithful in these matters, but they believe that we could have easily reached these conclusions by natural reason, without reference to the church. The conclusion of this way of thinking is that they believe that, as a matter of practice, we are able to simply argue by way of natural reason in order to transform the temporal sphere, without any reference to the church and the authority of the gospel. Practically, we all know how foolish this position is, but it sounds probable when presented by theorists. While in principle natural reason can reach many of these truths, in practice the effects of original and actual sin makes the presentation of these truths by the church and the healing of natural reason by grace necessary. Therefore, as we already saw above, Leo XIII teaches that, quote, no practical solution of this question will be found apart from the intervention of religion and of the church, end quote. Generally, Venerable Pius XII stated, quote, divine revelation must be considered morally necessary, so that those religious and moral truths which are not of their nature beyond the reach of reason in the present condition of the human race may be known by all men readily with a firm certainty and with freedom from error, end quote. The reason for this is stated in Donum Veritatis, where it is said, quote, revelation also contains moral teachings which per se could be known by natural reason. Access to them, however, is made difficult by man's sinful condition, end quote. Yet this is also something demanded by the unity of the human person and his various pursuits, which must be sublimated to a single end, that is, the beatific vision. Thus Venerable Pius XII wrote, quote, a true human order here below cannot be perfect or perfectible unless ordained toward the hereafter. This is an essential idea of Rerum Novarum. Thus, those Catholics promoting a new social order, who assert first social reform, then religious and moral life, err profoundly. Indeed, one cannot separate the first from the second, because this world cannot be separated from the other, nor man divided into two, as he is one living whole. End quote. In summary, the first principle teaches two things. First, the church is authoritative in political and economic matters. This does not mean that the church gives a specific practical political program. As stated in the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching, the church does not, quote, enter into questions of the merit of political programs, except as concerns their religious or moral implications, end quote. Rather, it does mean that the church gives us the foundational principles of Catholic social teaching that laymen have the right and duty to apply in their circumstances. St. Paul VI gives a beautiful image of this. Quote, the church has not hesitated to descend from her own proper religious sphere into that of the concrete conditions of social life. Like the Samaritan in the gospel parable, the church came down from her mount, meaning from the purely cultic realm, and made herself a minister of charity, not merely individual, but social, end quote. Second, not only is the church authoritative in political and economic matters, it is also necessary in such matters. This does not mean that men do not have the ability to morally reason without the church. Rather, it means that reason is so damaged by the effects of sin that the church is needed to provide those tools which open our eyes to do what was only partially seen before. Therefore, we cannot only advocate for Catholic social teaching on the grounds of its intrinsic reasonableness. Rather, we ought also to advocate for Catholic social teaching as the divinely revealed guardian of natural reason, which can liberate reason from the effects of sin. In the second principle, we have the most fundamental axiom of Catholic social teaching. We consider all the component parts of an economy that coalesce to a single end, the common good. Any economic error that we see in the various different false systems, such as capitalism or socialism, consists in placing the end in something improper. It is easy to misunderstand what is meant by the common good. The common good isn't merely what is good for the most amount of people. Rather, it consists in those goods that can be possessed in common, such as truth, goodness, virtue, justice, religion, etc. The common good consists in ordering us to our ultimate end, that is, God. So if an economy disposes towards hatred, violence, decadence, cruelty, etc., that economy is not ordered to the common good, even if the people are wealthy. When we look at other economic systems, their errors are based on placing their ends in other things. Socialism places the end of the economy in fostering the common possession of material goods. Therefore, they are led to the error of the abolition of private property. Thus, Pius XI stated, quote, "Socialism, wholly ignoring and indifferent to this sublime end of both man and society, affirms that human association has been instituted for the sake of material advantage alone." End quote. Further, St. John the 23rd stated, quote, "Socialism is founded on a doctrine of human society which is bound by time and takes no account of any objective other than that of material well-being." End quote. On the other hand, capitalism, also known as economic liberalism, places the end of the economy in the economic liberty of man, completely free from any interference of the state. Thus, Venerable Pius XII stated, quote, "The state in the 19th century, through excessive exaltation of liberty, considered as its exclusive scope the safeguarding of liberty by law, which made men so often unaware or forgetful or contemptuous of social duties." End quote. Contrary to both these false tendencies, whether towards materialism like the socialists or libertarianism like the capitalists, Catholic social teaching affirms that the immediate or proximate end of property is for the preservation of life. Yet it is not for the preservation of life for its own sake, but ultimately for the sake of those higher ends mentioned above, namely insofar as it frees us for those higher ends of religion. So, a better economy is not judged by a higher GDP, but to provide for the material needs of men in such a way as to help them get to heaven. Thus, Venerable Pius XII stated, quote, "The economic riches of a people do not properly consist in the abundance of goods measured according to a purely and solely material calculation of their worth, but in the fact that such an abundance represents and offers, really and effectively, the material basis sufficient for the proper personal development of its members." End quote. The idea of Catholic economic teaching is that the economy is meant to provide us with those material necessities that liberate us to be able to pursue those higher ends of religion. As Venerable Pius XII states, such a just economic situation, quote, "provides man with a secure material basis of the highest import, on which to rise to the fulfillment with reasonable liberty of his moral duties." End quote. Likewise, he states, quote, "The national economy has no other end than to secure without interruption the material conditions in which the individual life of the citizens may fully develop." End quote. In summary, the end of the economy in the mind of the Catholic Church is completely different than the end envisioned by the socialists or capitalists. Socialists are materialists and believe that the end of the economy is found in the material good of the people. On the other hand, the capitalists believe in economic liberalism, which exalts the liberty of the individual as the highest end. Contrary to both of these, Catholic economics believes that the common good is the end of the economy, that is, in providing material goods which liberate the people to pursue the ends of religion. As I mentioned above, all the parts of something are ordered to its end. Therefore, all the different aspects of the economy are ordered to the end stated in the second principle. From this, we are able to determine all the details of the Catholic teaching on the economy in a systematic manner. We know that creation is universally intended for the good of man. Yet we also know that we need to mix our efforts with these things to form usable goods. This process is called labor. In labor, we are attempting to fulfill the end of the economy. Yet this process is not done in isolation. It is done in common. We are social creatures who exist in societies. This is the key to understanding Rerum Novarum, as Pius XI pointed out so clearly. The two most important societies for our consideration are domestic society and civil society. Domestic society is the society of the family, and civil society is the society of the state. First, we must consider the implications for domestic society. The father of a family has a unique obligation to acquire property for his family. In order to carry out the sustenance of domestic society, it is not enough for somebody to simply have enough to buy bread and pay rent. Rather, there needs to be true and proper ownership. This gives stability and allows for a number of different benefits, such as inheritance. This leads us to the principle of distributism. The principle of distributism is able to oppose the dual errors of socialism and capitalism. Socialism opposes nature and justice by stripping man of the fruits of his labor. On the other hand, capitalism destroys the necessary preconditions for the stability of domestic society. In order to be stable, there needs to be the ownership of property and, ideally, the means of production. Capitalism concentrates the ownership of fruitful property in the hands of the few. whereas distributism sees the ownership of such property among the many as a precondition for being able to form stable domestic societies. Socialism believes that the society should own the means of production. Capitalism believes that the few or successful should own the means of production. Catholic economics believes that individuals should own the means of production as widely as possible. This immediately draws forth two conclusions about how a just economy looks like. First, we have the immediate conclusion in terms of economic subsidiarity. As mentioned above, having the widest possible distribution of fruitful goods is ideal. Under a capitalist system, it is ideal to have a butcher company with thousands of butchers getting paid for their work, but ultimately not owning the means of production. Under a distributist model, this would be seen as a bad situation. It is, of course, necessary that there be employees in certain circumstances, but this is from defect or necessity. There are some who do not have the natural capabilities to fruitfully use the means of production without external direction, and there are others who are being trained to be able to do so and need to be apprentices. Ideally and ordinarily, each butcher would have his own butcher shop, and the butchers, rather than being simple employees in a meat company, would form some sort of butcher guild for mutual assistance. While this may not maximize the GDP of the nation, it does distribute goods in such a way as to effectively carry out the ends of the ownership of property. Yet, there are obviously certain goods that cannot be manufactured under such a model. Thus, economic subsidiarity allows that there be the concentration of the means of production when it is necessary by the very nature of the product. Thus, for example, you cannot have computer and cell phone makers in every city. Here we see the legitimate necessity of an employer-employee relationship in certain industries, which we will cover later. Among these industries, there are certain ones that, by their very nature, cannot allow for the transfer of the means of production into the hands of an individual or group of individuals due to the disproportionate power this would allow over the state, or for some other reason. These are those industries which, in the words of Pius XI, quote, carry with them a power too great to be left to private individuals without injury to the community at large, end quote. In these cases, there are certain industries which ought to be nationalized, and the various fruits of these industries are used to run the state, rather than through excessive taxation. Yet, as taught by St. John XXIII, it should be carefully considered whether such a nationalization is absolutely necessary. Quote, the state and other agencies of public law must not extend their ownership beyond what is clearly required by considerations of the common good properly understood. And even then, there must be safeguards. Otherwise, private ownership could be reduced beyond measure, or even worse, completely destroyed. End quote. As an example, weapons manufacturing and various financial industries allow for private individuals who own these means of production to oppose and compete with the state for authority in the secular realm, which is completely unacceptable due to the supremacy of the state in the secular realm. Or we could think about industries like the oil or gas industries that, beside granting undue authority, also allows for uniquely prosperous goods to be directed towards the good of the few, rather than the good of the people who reside in the nation. The most dangerous instances of these industries are those which form what St. John XXIII called a plutocracy. International capitalism has taken a stranglehold over entire nations, fomenting wars and civil unrest. We see this today with the enslaving of entire nations and the broad corruption of morals at the hands of international capitalism. A just economic system eliminates the possibility of such destructive multinational corporations. This plutocracy was already warned against by Pius XI in paragraphs 104 to 109. To summarize, economic subsidiarity requires that the means of production be distributed as widely as possible, and, when necessary, concentrate the means of production, whether in the hands of an employer or in the hands of the state. Second, we have the concept of the just wage. As mentioned above, there are many cases where there must be a relationship of an employer to an employee. Here, in line with what has been said above, there are two applications. First, it is ideal, in accordance with distributism, that there be some sort of share in the means of production. In such a model, the ownership of the company is not completely in the hands of the employer, but there is some sort of ownership in the hands of the employee. The description given to this by Pius XI is that of, quote, wage earners and other employees participate in the ownership or the management or in some way share in the profits, end quote. St. John XXIII says that, quote, it is especially desirable today that workers gradually come to share in the ownership of their company by ways and in the manner that seem most suitable." End quote. Pius XI treats this at length in Quadragesimo Anno, from paragraphs 53 to 62. He treats it from the perspective of labor and capital. Labor and capital have a natural union with one another. Socialism is unnatural in that it ascribes the fruitfulness simply to labor, and capitalism is unnatural in that it acquires the fruitfulness simply to capital. Thus, socialism provides all the fruitfulness to the one laboring, and capitalism to the owner of capital. Catholic social teaching requires a harmony between the two, so that the worker has a share in the fruitfulness of the work of his hands by real ownership of the capital that is made fruitful by his labor. Here, Pius XI calls out both the class of the wealthy for wishing to take for themselves all the fruitfulness of labor, and the class of the non-owning workers for wishing to completely strip the wealthy from the fruitfulness of their capital. Rather, he introduces a third solution. This solution is to turn the non-owning workers into a class of owning workers. It is only in this way that individual workers are freed from the wage slavery that capitalism has put them under. Second, it is necessary, in accordance with justice, that the employee be paid a just wage. This is a central proposition of Catholic social teaching. A wage is not just due to the agreement between the employer and the employee. Rather, a wage is just due to its ability to fulfill the ends of a wage. The ends of a wage are exactly what was laid out above with the acquisition of property by labor. That is, it is able to sustain domestic society. First, it is completely irrelevant whether there has been an agreement between the employer and the employee. This is taught by a number of different popes. St. John the 23rd says that this is, quote, "a clear violation of justice, even supposing the contract of work to have been freely entered into by both parties," end quote. Leo XIII condemns the idea that, quote, "wages are regulated by free consent," end quote. Second, the end of labor should be fulfilled insofar as a man is able to support the material needs of his family. Thus, St. John the 23rd states that the wage must, quote, "allow them to live a truly human life and to fulfill their family obligations in a worthy manner," end quote. St. John Paul II states that, quote, "a workman's wages should be sufficient to enable him to support himself, his wife, and his children," end quote. Third, beyond simply fulfilling the material needs of the family, the worker should be able to advance himself to the ownership of fruitful property in accordance with the principles of distributism. This point is clarified by Leo XIII when he states that, beyond material necessities, a man should be able to have, quote, "the ownership of productive property, which he can transmit to his children by inheritance," end quote. This situation is vividly described by Leo XIII earlier in the same encyclical, when he writes, quote, "if he lives sparingly, saves money, and for greater security invests his savings in land, the land in such case is only his wages under another form, and consequently a working man's little estate thus purchased should be as completely at his full disposal as are the wages he receives from his labor," end quote. This particular detail is one of the most central to the papal teaching on the just wage. The social development of society, in their mind, comes with the greater economic development of families, who are able to own productive property and pass down this productive property to their children. This leads to true liberty. Pius XI dwells on this point at length from paragraphs 61 to 75 of his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. Beyond his simply material needs, this wage should, in the words of Venerable Pius XII, quote, "secure for the father of the family the healthy liberty he needs in order to fulfill the duties assigned him by the Creator, regarding the physical, spiritual, and religious welfare of his family," end quote. Yet, a question can arise at this point. While it is necessary to include in a just wage the ability to, by thrift, secure productive property for one's family, is it equally necessary to have a distribution of the means of production as a part of the wage? Or is this simply an ideal? Pius XI writes, quote, "those who declare that a contract of hiring and being hired is unjust of its own nature, and hence a partnership contract must take its place, are certainly in error," end quote. While it is certainly ideal for such a contract to exist, as he argues in the following paragraphs, it is not necessary, since there is not an essential connection between such a contract and the purposes of the wage. Rather, it is possible with a just wage to achieve these ends by thrift. Therefore, unlike the just wage, ownership of the means of productive is not owed in justice, although it is strongly encouraged. In summary, the collection of men in domestic society and the ends of property require the distribution of the means of production. This distributism is distinct both from the collectivization of the means of production by the communists and the restriction of the means of production in the hands of the few by the capitalist. This distribution leads to the principle of economic subsidiarity that favors individual endeavors over corporate endeavors. Yet, there are certain cases where production is done by industries or even by the state. Distributism can even be fulfilled in the labor market by the dual compensation of both capital and ownership. This compensation is ruled by objective laws that determine a just wage in lines with the necessary ends of labor. Now that we've went over the implications of man in domestic society, we must also consider the implications of man in civil society. As we mentioned above, the national economy is ordered towards the common good, immediately towards the fulfillment of the material necessities of man. It is from this consideration of the end that Venerable Pius XII immediately draws forth the necessary conclusion that the state must be involved in the economy. He states, quote, "To safeguard the inviolable sphere of the rights of the human person, and to facilitate the fulfillment of his duties, should be the essential office of every public authority." Does this not flow from that genuine concept of the common good which the state is called upon to promote? End quote. Here, we need to distinguish between two aspects of property, its possession and its use. To possess property is to have a title or claim of ownership over something. To use property is to somehow bring that property into relation with others in civil society, for example by buying, selling, starting a company, etc. The socialists and capitalists err when considering the possession and use of property. The socialists err by saying that it is unjust for an individual to possess property. This is false. It is natural and just for one to possess the fruits of his labor when justly acquired. Leo XIII spends a great deal of time refuting this error in Rerum Novarum, especially from paragraphs 6 to 13. In fact, this error is so dangerous that Pius XI teaches, as quoted above, that socialism is a solution worse than the problems of capitalism. It is so deadly that Pius XI forbids Catholics from joining organizations with even a moderated form of socialism. The distinction between these two aspects of property was one of the most common misunderstandings of Rerum Novarum. Thus, Pius XI treats the question at length from paragraphs 45 to 51. He calls these the individual and social aspects of property. Emphasizing the individual aspect to the detriment of the social aspect is called individualism by the pontiff and characterizes capitalism, whereas the reverse error is called collectivism and characterizes socialism. When we consider these two aspects of property, along with the principle of subsidiarity, we are able to provide a proper synthesis of the role of the state in the economy. First, against the capitalists, we deny that there is some invisible hand that is meant to unify the various forces of the economy to their end. Yet with the capitalists, we understand that the initiative in the economy takes place on the part of individuals. Second, against the socialists, we deny that class warfare can bring about unity in the economy. Yet with the socialists, we understand that the state must guide men towards the proper ends of the economy in order for there to be unity of purpose. The solution of refuting the errors of each comes from the higher synthesis of the principle of subsidiarity, which allows for the proper independence and deference to the lower levels of the economy. This is treated beautifully by Pius XI in paragraph 88. In considering this distinction related to the earlier distinction between ownership and use, we are able to come to two central theses. First, quote, "They are in error who assert that ownership and its right use are limited by the same boundaries, and it is much farther still from the truth to hold that a right to property is destroyed or lost by reason of abuse or non-use." End quote. Second, quote, "Public authority under the guiding light always of the natural and divine law can determine more accurately, upon consideration of the true requirements of the common good, what is permitted and what is not permitted to owners in the use of their property." End quote. With these two theses in mind, we are able to see that the role of the state provides a harmony between the two aspects of property. Quote, "When the state brings private ownership into harmony with the needs of the common good, it does not commit a hostile act against private owners, but rather does them a friendly service, for it thereby effectively prevents the private possession of goods, which the author of nature in his most wise providence ordained for the support of human life, from causing intolerable evils, and thus rushing to its own destruction. It does not destroy private possessions, but safeguards them, and it does not weaken private property rights, but strengthens them." End quote. It is not by accident that the treatment of civil society is after the treatment of man in domestic society. Civil society is something that is after domestic society, in order towards its good. Thus, civil society cannot despoil an individual of what has been gained by his own initiative. Thus, St. John the 23rd states, quote, "The right of private ownership of goods, including productive goods, has permanent validity. It is part of the natural order, which teaches that the individual is prior to society, and society must be ordered to the good of the individual." End quote. It is here that we agree with the capitalists, yet we disagree with the capitalists on 2 points. First, the right over property is not absolute. This is an important point to dwell on. While we spend a great deal of time refuting the nonsense of the socialists, it is not true that we completely agree with the capitalists. As St. John Paul II put it, quote, "Leo XIII is well aware that private property is not an absolute value, nor does he fail to proclaim the necessary complementary principles, such as the universal destination of earth's goods." End quote. St. John the 23rd writes, quote, "Private ownership of property, including that of productive goods, is a natural right which the state cannot suppress. But it naturally entails a social obligation as well. It is a right which must be exercised not only for one's own personal benefit, but also for the benefit of others." End quote. The reason for this is that the sustenance of man is a higher good than an individual's right to the possession of private property. Therefore, St. John the 23rd, commenting on the works of Venerable Pius XII, wrote, quote, "The right of every man to use these for his own sustenance is prior to every other economic right, even that of private property. The right to the private possession of material goods is admittedly a natural one. Nevertheless, in the objective order established by God, the right to property cannot stand in the way of the axiomatic principle that the goods which are created by God for all men should flow to all alike, according to the principles of justice and charity." End quote. Therefore, while we admit that the individual and family are prior to the state, it is equally true that the universal destination of goods is prior to the individual and family. As Pope Leo XIV recently taught, the universal destination of goods stands as the primary principle that directs justice. Quote, "In this promotion of the common good, our social responsibility is grounded in God's creative act, which gives everyone a share in the goods of the earth. Like those goods, the fruits of human labor should be equally accessible to all. Helping the poor is a matter of justice before a question of charity." End quote. We can draw forth 2 conclusions from this of a practical sort. First, in cases of necessity, one can be dispossessed of property, such as, for example, when a starving man needs bread. Second, one has a moral obligation to voluntarily give away portions of his money to alleviate others. Thus, Pius XI states, quote, "A person's superfluous income, that is, income which he does not need to sustain life fittingly with dignity, is not left wholly to his own free determination. Rather, the sacred scriptures and the fathers of the church constantly declare in the most explicit language that the rich are bound by a very grave precept to practice almsgiving, beneficence, and munificence." End quote. The second disagreement that we have with the capitalists concerns the use of property. Fundamental to this reflection is the fact that the use of property is done in civil society. Thus, the state has a right and duty to order this to the common good. This comes from the very purpose of the establishment of the state, as mentioned above. Thus, St. John the 23rd writes, quote, "As for the state, its whole reason for existing is the realization of the common good in the temporal order. It cannot, therefore, hold aloof from economic matters." End quote. Thus, one of the most central errors for Leo XIII to oppose was that of the liberalism of the capitalists, who, in the words of Pius XI, taught that, quote, "Government must be thought of as a mere guardian of law and of good order." End quote. These principles, quote, "long prevented effective action by those governing the state." End quote. This takes both a negative and positive form. First, positively, the state has a duty to actively encourage and facilitate industry. Quote, "It must do all in its power to promote the production of a sufficient supply of material goods." End quote. This is summarized well by Leo XIII, who writes, quote, "Though the entire scheme of laws and institutions, both public and individual well-being, may develop spontaneously out of the very structure and administration of the state." End quote. Yet we must remember the fact that economic initiative is done by the individual, which distinguishes us from the socialists. Therefore, the positive action of the state consists in the encouragement of the individual to be economic actors, and the encouragement of just and free competition within due limits. According to St. John the 23rd, ordinary positive tasks of the state in relation to the economy are found in, quote, "directing, stimulating, coordinating, supplying, and integrating." End quote. Yet we must be careful here. One of the most destructive consequences of socialism is that it is prejudicial to the liberty of man in the economic realm. Thus, St. John the 23rd wrote that, quote, "However extensive and far-reaching the influence of the state on the economy may be, It must never be exerted to the extent of depriving the individual citizen of his freedom of action. It must rather augment his freedom, while effectively guaranteeing the protection of his essential personal rights." End quote. Thus, quote, "History and experience testify that in those political regimes which do not recognize the rights of private ownership of goods, productive included, the exercise of freedom in almost every other direction is suppressed or stifled." End quote. Subsidiarity, as mentioned above, means that problems and initiatives ought to be dealt with at the lowest level when possible. Thus, the economic initiative is primarily taken by the individual, whether by himself or with others. The state's intervention cannot replace this. Thus, Pius XI wrote that, quote, "The true aim of all social activity should be to help members of the social body, but never to destroy or absorb them." End quote. Summarizing, St. John the 23rd wrote, quote, "It should be stated at the outset that in the economic order, first place must be given to the personal initiative of private citizens, working either as individuals or in associations with each other in various ways for the furtherance of common interests. But the civil power must also have a hand in the economy. It has to promote production in a way best calculated to achieve social progress and the well-being of all citizens." End quote. Against the capitalists, and with due consideration of free competition, Pius XI describes the role of the state positively in paragraph 110. This is meant to fulfill what the popes have called a, quote, "right to work." The reason for this comes from the necessity to work. As Venerable Pius XII states, quote, "It is necessary because without it one cannot secure what is indispensable to life, and man has a natural grave individual obligation to maintain life." End quote. Now, when there is such a necessity and an obligation, there is a corresponding right which must be provided. Quote, "The personal duty to labor imposed by nature corresponds and follows the natural right of each individual to make of labor the means to provide for his own life and that of his children." End quote. Since man has a duty and obligation to labor, there is an obligation on the part of the public authority to provide for opportunities, whether directly or indirectly, for work. Thus, Venerable Pius XII wrote, quote, "If employer and worker do not fulfill their functions, or cannot, because of special extraordinary emergencies, fulfill them, then it falls back on the state to intervene in the field of labor, and in the divisions and distribution of work, according to the form and measure that the common good, properly understood, demands." End quote. It is useless for us to continually profess the right to private ownership of property without practically ensuring that such ownership is made an effective reality. As stated by St. John the 23rd, quote, "It is not enough to assert that the right to own private property and the means of production is inherent in human nature. We must also insist on the extension of this right in practice to all classes of citizens." End quote. Second, negatively, the state must defend the population against encroachments against justice by those who make use of property. Pius XI summarizes this action when he states, quote, "Just freedom of action must, of course, be left to the individual citizens and to families, yet only on condition that the common good be preserved, and wrong to any individual be abolished." End quote. One does not have the right to use property as he pleases. Thus, for example, the state can prohibit buying and selling at unjust prices, the hiring practice below a just wage, usury, etc. This is especially found in labor, where the state must guard the worker against employment that is, quote, "harmful to their material and spiritual interests." End quote. In summary, the very purpose of civil society requires that it be concerned with the economic life of the citizens. In order to better understand how this functions, we need to distinguish between the ownership and use of property. When it comes to the ownership of property, this is a right that all men have, contrary to socialism, yet such a right is not absolute. Due to the universal destination of goods, there is a certain obligation on the part of the state to foster and bring about the distribution of property to all men. Further, when it comes to the use of property, it is the state's duty to regulate this in accordance with the common good, since the use of property is a social act. Yet, we ought to temper these considerations of state intervention with the principle of subsidiarity. In conclusion, Pius XI attacked certain individuals who thought that the teaching of Rerum Novarum was, quote, "a kind of imaginary ideal of perfection more desirable than attainable." End quote. It is urgent for us always to reject the temptation to view the state of the world in this way. The teaching of the Church on society is not merely an ideal. It is an end that we can always and constantly work towards step by step. It is up to us, the lay faithful, to put this teaching into practice.